What's up, everybody? Hope y'all are having a good one. It is Kip here, your whiskey tour guide, and we are ready for another toast to history. Today, we're going to look at a little something that might be a little controversial. Not really, but we're going to play it. So we talked a little bit about some of the firsts that have happened in our country as it relates to whiskey. In our last two episodes, we talked about prohibition and the temperance movement, the Anti-Saloon League, and how that the temperance movement can be viewed as our first political lobby group in our country's history, and it revolved around the world of whiskey and alcohol. We've looked at the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897 and how that is the first consumer protection act in our country's history. We see these things where, again, America did not invent whiskey, but unlike any other country, it is interwoven into the very fabric of our existence. Now, early on, we're going to talk a little bit of early history. So we have the immigrants' migration from Europe into the Americas. We have some things happening. We're not going to get into all that, but we have the situation where we end up in war with England. The Revolutionary War, the war for our America's freedom. Now, that war was primarily about taxation without representation, because the colonists were being taxed, tax after tax after tax. The sugar tax, the stamp tax, the paper tax, the intolerable acts, which was a series of taxes. Then we have the tea tax, which ends up in a little episode that you may know as the Boston Tea Party. So we are very averse to this taxation notion right off the bat. So now we're in this Revolutionary War. The war lasts 8 years. Finally, we end up winning that war, have a constitutional Congress. Now we have our first government structure and election, and George Washington is elected our president, who obviously was previously general of our Revolutionary Army. Now, you have to remember, as colonists, we didn't have our own economy. We didn't have our own funds, money, currency. We had none of that. So when it came to fighting the Revolutionary War, we didn't have anything to fight a war with financially, much less uniforms, weapons, ammunition, things of that nature. So we had to be supplied by other countries. Now, as we come down the road to this first presidency, we're having a hard time paying that war debt back. So a guy enters the picture, doesn't enter the picture, he'd really been in America's picture from the very beginning, similar to George Washington, a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, effectively, in that first administration with President Washington, was his Secretary of the Treasury, and one of his things was to try to pay the war debt. And after several years in our early beginnings of a country, that war debt was not being able to be paid. So Alexander Hamilton proposes what became known as the whiskey tax, the first tax in our country's history, the first commodity tax that wasn't on the commodity itself, but on the producers, on the distillers. I'm going to read you a couple quotes here in reference to this. Now, Alexander Hamilton, I'm not going to do a full biopic on him. We will do that one of these days. But he was not only in Washington's cabinet, he was a close friend and ally even prior to the presidency He worked with Washington on several things. Obviously, he was the key player in writing our Constitution. He's the founder of the Federalist Party, our nation's first political party, and of the nation's first financial system, promoting standardized and national banking. And he also founded the New York Post newspaper. I'm not here to talk about all that, just a little reference. So, when Hamilton proposed the tax on whiskey, again, it wasn't on the commodity from a buyer's standpoint, but on a production standpoint. So in 1791, this is a quote from a book called The Whiskey Rebellion by William Hodgland. He says, with the passage of the excise law in March of 1791, the executive branch had divided the nation into federal districts, each corresponding to a state. The larger states were further divided into surveys, whose inspectors' responsibilities included hiring deputies, registering stills, monitoring production, coordinating collection, and reporting violators. This was all part of the whiskey tax plan that Hamilton had put into play. As Hodgland continues, he says Secretary Hamilton sent all excise inspectors a standard operating procedure manual into which he poured his love of tight processes, precise record keeping, and diligent follow through. In the manual, consistency and documentation are everything. Not here today to debate taxation, but we can call into question an excise tax very quickly on the heels of a 8-year-long war that we fought because of taxation, but that's neither here nor there. What we want to look at is, again, this whiskey tax is the first tax proposed in our country's history. Now, the biggest problem with the tax, other than the fact that people didn't want it, because, again, these are the same people that just ended a war not that long ago because of taxation. The big problem with this was the way that the tax was written by Alexander Hamilton. And during the Revolutionary War, when that migration happened into what we would call Louisville, but in Bourbon County, Western Virginia, distilleries were beginning, businesses operating. But the guys on the East Coast, the colonists, were still just farmers, maybe even farmer distillers, but they distilled just a few weeks out of the year. They distilled their leftover grain. They were not actual business distillers. They were farmer distillers. As a farmer knows, you don't waste anything. They would always use their still, kind of like a homebrew kit like you and I would maybe have in our basement today. And so that tax was very unpopular amongst the farmers. And this is from the Book of Bourbon by Gary and Marty Reagan. It says, we should try to understand what these new taxes meant to the farmer distillers of the time. It was difficult to pay because they didn't have any cash. They might have been making a decent living, but many, indeed most, transactions at that time were conducted by barter. It's a grand way to do business. Pop into the store, the town corner center, with a few quarts of whiskey, trade one to the local seamstress in return for a new dress for the missus, another to the fishmonger who will supply you with dinner for the next 4 Fridays, and when the landlord is passing by, maybe you can persuade him to take a gallon of your finest whiskey in lieu of the few months' rent. The scene and the amounts were merely hypothetical, but it gives you a rough idea of why the farmers had empty pockets. The other thing was this: the way the law was set up is it was not based, again, on a taxable amount by a consumer, but by the production amount of the distillery. So these distilleries now that were operating as businesses, regardless if they had a 50-gallon still, a 200-gallon still, a 500-gallon still, or multiples, under Hamilton's plan, he would walk in and go, here's your still, here's the production capability. If you run this from your business 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, for example, this is your production capability for the year, so here's your tax bill. Problem are the farmer distillers on the East Coast who were farmers, who had a little still on their property. They only ran that still a few weeks out of the year. under Hamilton's plan, he goes, okay, well, here's your still. It may only be a 2-gallon still or a 5-gallon still. But if you do this 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, here's your production capability for the year. Here's your tax bill. And they're like, whoa, no, 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 no. That is not the case. We are not distillers. We're farmers. Farming is our business. That is our livelihood. That's what we are. The still process, the whiskey process, was hobby and economical, as we just read. It was barter, it was trade, it was money, and a little bit for themselves through the winter months. So the tax didn't go well, and it led to something which we'll talk about in another toast to history, another first in our history, and another first that revolves around whiskey, and that is a bit of a rebellion. We'll talk about that later. But for today, as we close, again, another first. The first tax levied in our country's history was on the number one commodity in our new young country, and that was whiskey. The whiskey tax. The first tax. First tax that was debated, refuted, and fought over. Tax that eventually went away for a short time, but through the years, whiskey and taxes have quite the history, intermingling throughout our 250-ish years of history. So, whiskey and tax. A marriage made in heaven, maybe? I don't know. Tax isn't any commodity, maybe? I don't know. But there you have it. Tonight's toast to history, whiskey and tax. And specifically, the very first tax in our country's history. The whiskey tax of 1791. Hope you all have a great one. Cheers.